March 28, 1945. The end was supposed to be certain. The German army was a hollow shell, retreating on every front. American tanks moved deep into the heart of Bavaria, traveling miles without meeting resistance. But as the scouts of the United States 45th Infantry Division reached the outskirts of Aschaffenburg, the column ground to a halt. The lead jeeps braked hard. The soldiers looked up. Dozens of bodies hung from the wooden lampposts lining the main road. These were not combatants in uniform. The camera would show gray-haired men, middle-aged women, and teenagers barely 16 years old. Each corpse had a cardboard sign wired around its neck. The ink was fresh. The signs read, "Here hangs a traitor because he believed in the Americans." These victims had not fired a single shot. They had not joined the resistance. They had simply watched the German lines collapse and reached for white bedsheets. They hung the fabric from their windows to signal surrender and protect their homes from shelling. For this act of survival, their own local commander ordered their immediate execution. The American infantrymen stared at the swaying figures. They did not feel pity. They felt a cold, sharpening rage. They looked toward the city center. It was a historic medieval fortress town filled with ancient stone towers and timber-framed houses. It was a monument to German history. Why should they die for this place? The Americans had a choice. They refused to enter a meat grinder of house-to-house urban combat for a population that murdered its own neighbors. Risking lives for a beautiful city was no longer an option. The American commander reached for his radio handset. He did not request a tactical strike. He did not ask for precision. He called in the heavy artillery units and gave a single, blunt order. He told them to level the entire grid. Every stone, every roof, every cellar was to be turned into gray dust. His logic was simple. If the defenders wanted to die for a collapsing regime, the American guns would help them. The first shells began to fall minutes later. There was no turning back. March 28, 1945. On this day, the Americans reached the outskirts of Aschaffenburg. To understand the carnage that followed, we must look at the man in charge, Major Emil Lambert. Lambert was no ordinary officer. He was a radical fanatic and a devout believer in National Socialism. By this stage of the war, most German commanders saw the end coming. They were looking for ways to surrender with their lives intact. But Lambert had different plans. Adolf Hitler had issued a direct command, Festung Aschaffenburg. This meant Fortress Aschaffenburg. The order was simple: defend the city until every stone was leveled. Lambert followed this instruction to the letter. He did not care about the women and children trapped in the basements. He did not care about the centuries of history in the city streets. He only cared about total obedience to the Reich. How did he build his army? The regular divisions were gone. To fill the ranks, Lambert gathered the Volkssturm. These were the People's Storm units. The footage would show a desperate line of defense, old men clutching rusted hunting rifles, boys from the Hitler Youth barely 15 years old, and wounded soldiers dragged directly from their hospital beds. Lambert gave them a brutal ultimatum. He told them that anyone who attempted to surrender would be shot on sight. Anyone who displayed a white flag would be hanged. But this was only the beginning. The civilians of Aschaffenburg were paralyzed by fear. From their windows, they watched the American tanks rumbling toward the city limits. They wanted to save their families from the coming fire. In the dark, behind locked doors, they sewed white flags from bedsheets. But Lambert's network of spies was everywhere. They listened at doors and watched the alleyways. On the morning of the American arrival, execution squads moved through the streets. The visual record is grim. The squads dragged civilians from their homes. They used lampposts and trees as gallows. When the American soldiers finally entered the outskirts, they did not see a city ready to surrender. They saw a population held hostage by a fanatic. The United States 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, arrived on March 28th. The soldiers felt confident. They expected another routine capture of a German town. They believed the white flags would appear as soon as the first shells landed. They were wrong. The Americans sent a small force of infantry into the streets. There was no mistake. The battle for Aschaffenburg was about to become a bloodbath. Thus, the siege began. 1,300 hours, The first squads entered the suburbs. They moved down quiet streets. Every window was shut tight. Every shop door was locked. The silence was absolute. Then, a single rifle shot. A machine gun burst followed. Then, the scream of a Panzerfaust rocket. The Americans scrambled for cover behind stone walls and garden fences. Fire came from every direction, from the church steeple, from basement windows, from the openings of the sewers. But it was not just soldiers behind the barrels. The Americans looked through their sights and froze. They saw civilians pulling the triggers, old men wearing suits, women dropping grenades from rooftops, children firing rifles from behind curtains. Major Lambert had forced the entire population into the line of fire. He told the citizens the Americans would butcher them during a surrender. He turned civilians into combatants. Why did the Americans stop? They were trained for war, not executions, but hesitation cost lives. They did not want to shoot women or children. While they hesitated, they died. Casualties mounted. In the footage, ambulance jeeps race back and forth across open fields. The easy victory had turned into a meat grinder. The American commanders met in a tent outside the city limits. They were no longer calm. They were losing seasoned soldiers to civilians who should have been waving white flags. Then, the scouts returned with reports. They found bodies of German citizens hanging in the town square. Major Lambert had executed his own people for trying to stop the fighting. The mood shifted. This was no longer a liberation. It was a punishment. The American commander looked at the map of Aschaffenburg. His finger pointed to Schloss Johannesburg. It was a massive stone fortress dominating the skyline. Lambert was inside those walls. The commander made a decision. He would not send any more infantry into the narrow streets. He would not play games with castles. He chose brute force. He called for the heavy equipment, 15.5mm long tom artillery, M12 gun motor carriages. These were massive self-propelled guns designed to crack concrete bunkers. He called the Air Force. A new order reached the front lines. Pull back, get out of the streets. The mission had changed. They were no longer taking the city. They were going to erase it. The bombardment began the next morning. It was not a tactical strike. The Americans lined up their heavy guns on the hills overlooking the roofs. They lowered the barrels. Usually, artillery fires in an arc over miles of terrain. Here, they fired point blank. They aimed directly at the buildings. The first shells hit. The sound of stone shattering filled the valley. The era of restraint was over. March 28, 1945. Systematic destruction begins. The American army moves block by block, house by house. 155mm shells strike medieval timber-framed buildings. The structures do not just break, they disintegrate. Fires ignite. The city of Aschaffenburg starts to burn. High above, P-47 thunderbolts dive from the clouds. Inside the city streets, the footage would show an apocalypse. Major Lambert sits in a reinforced bunker beneath the castle. He orders his men to hold their positions. He shouts that the Americans are weak and afraid to enter the city. But the Americans are not afraid. They are efficient. They decide there is no reason to die for a city that refuses to surrender. An American sergeant writes in his diary, "We just sat on the hill and watched it burn." He sees bodies hanging from lampposts. He feels nothing. He writes that they brought this on themselves. This was a controversial decision. An entire city destroyed to save American lives. At first glance, it looks like a war crime. But in reality, it was the logic of total war. Was it justified or excessive? The shelling lasts for days. The city is a ruin, but Schloss Johannesburg still stands. It is a massive fortress of red sandstone built in the 1600s. The walls are 8 feet thick. Lambert is inside with his most fanatical troops. The Americans move in to finish the job. They do not send infantry to storm the gates. They bring up an M12 gun motor carriage. This is a massive 155mm cannon mounted on tank tracks. They park the vehicle directly in front of the castle at point-blank range. The German soldiers look through the arrow slits. They see the massive barrel pointing at their faces. The first shell hits the main tower. Stone explodes. Dust fills the air. The Americans fire again and again. They punch holes through walls that stood for 300 years. The castle catches fire. The roof collapses. Inside, the wounded are screaming. Teenage soldiers are crying. They beg Lambert to surrender. They tell him they cannot fight a wall of fire. Lambert pulls his pistol. He threatens to execute his own men, but the soldiers have reached their limit. On the morning of April 3rd, the firing stops. A white flag appears from a hole in the masonry. The Americans hold their fire. German soldiers walk out slowly. They are covered in red sandstone dust. They cough and stumble. They look like ghosts. Then Major Lambert emerges. He wears a clean uniform and his medals. He walks with his head high. He approaches the American commander, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. This is the same Felix Sparks who will later liberate Dachau. Lambert salutes. He starts a speech about honor and duty. Sparks does not listen. He looks at the ruins. He looks at the smoke and the dead civilians in the streets. Sparks does not salute back. He speaks to his military police. Get him out of my sight before I shoot him myself. Lambert is stripped of his weapons and thrown into a jeep. As the vehicle moves, the citizens of Aschaffenburg crawl out of their cellars. They do not cheer for the major. They spit at him. They call him a murderer. They scream that he destroyed their homes. The battle for Aschaffenburg lasted 10 days. It should have lasted 10 hours. Because of one man's fanaticism, 90% of the city is gone. Hundreds of civilians are dead. Hundreds of Americans are killed or wounded. General Patton arrives to inspect the ruins. He looks at the piles of rubble. He is grimly satisfied. Patton calls it a good lesson. He states that he will not trade American lives for German buildings. He uses the city as a warning. For the rest of the war, the Third Army sends a message to every town. Remember Aschaffenburg. Most towns surrender immediately. The destruction of one city saved thousands of lives because it proved the Americans were not bluffing. But what happened to Major Lambert? He was not treated as a prisoner of war. He was put on trial for murder, not for killing Americans, but for the German civilians he executed for trying to surrender. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Later, in the confusion of post-war appeals, his sentence was commuted. He lived, but he lived in disgrace. The story of Aschaffenburg is not about glory. It is about the terrible logic of war. The American soldiers did not want to destroy the city, but when they saw the bodies on the lampposts, they stopped being liberators. They became destroyers. Mercy has a limit. When you push a good man too far, you do not get a negotiation. You get a heavy shell through your front door. The commander chose his men over the architecture. The debate continues today. Thus ended the siege.